My name is Althea Markham. I am 72 years old, a retired librarian who still files her grocery lists in alphabetical order and keeps the front porch geraniums trimmed as if they were my card catalog. I've lived in Savannah my entire life, and though age has softened my knees, it hasn't dulled the part of me that consents when words are weighted. That morning, Damon's message lit up my phone. Family dinner, important matters, 6 p.m. No heart emoji. No love you. Mom. Just clipped words that read more like a summons than an invitation. My stomach soured immediately. Damon rarely used that tone unless he wanted something. I stared at the screen while the late April sun spilled across my kitchen counter, warming the worn wood, but not me. By 6, I was climbing the brick steps to his house on Gaston Street. The air was heavy with wisteria, but I felt none of its sweetness. Damon opened the door with a smile too wide, too careful. Clarabelle swept in behind him, perfume trailing, hands busy straightening the collar of his shirt as if they were preparing for an audience. The dining room table was already set, lasagna steaming at the center, a bottle of Merlot breathing beside crystal glasses. It struck me Clarabelle usually ordered takeout. Tonight, everything was plated like a magazine spread. I took my seat at the end of the table, the place I had always kept at family gatherings, though the warmth of that role felt strangely absent. We exchanged pleasantries, Damon asking about my arthritis, Clarabelle complimenting my scarf. But the words fell flat. Their eyes were elsewhere. I caught them leaning toward each other, whispering over the sideboard. A stack of papers sat half hidden beneath a folded napkin. Damon's hand moved across them, the faint scratch of a pen, and when I glanced up, Clarabelle shot me a quick, guilty look before sliding the pile farther out of sight. I speared a forkful of lasagna and kept my face calm, though my pulse quickened. Years of reading body language across library tables had trained me well, the way Damon's jaw tightened, the way Clarabelle's fingers drummed against the stem of her glass. Something rehearsed was unfolding, and I was the only one without a script. The lasagna cooled on my plate as I sat in silence, waiting for them to deliver their lines. The room hummed like a stage before the curtain lifted. Damon and Clarabelle played their parts with studied precision, and I was the sole audience member unaware of the script. Damon checked his watch twice in 5 minutes, as if he feared missing his cue. Clarabelle filled the silence with exaggerated warmth, her voice lilting whenever she addressed me. "You look lovely tonight, Althea," she said, her eyes scanning my scarf again. "That color, it makes your skin glow." I gave her a small smile, polite but unpersuaded. Clarabelle had never been one for compliments, unless they served a purpose. Her bracelets clinked as she refilled my wine glass, the gesture oddly ceremonial, as though buttering me up required more than words. Damon cleared his throat, then cut into his lasagna with mechanical precision. I watched him, my son, the boy who once smeared tomato sauce across his cheeks with careless joy. Tonight, every movement of his knife and fork seemed rehearsed. My gaze drifted toward the sideboard again. The papers lay beneath the folded napkin, but the corner had slipped just enough to betray a line of ink. I leaned forward slightly, pretending to adjust my napkin, and caught sight of my name, Althea M., scrawled in a hand too jagged to be mine. The world stilled for a breath. My name, but not my writing, my signature. Reduced to a counterfeit stroke of pen, I felt the ache of betrayal bloom behind my ribs, sharp and slow, yet curiously steadied by a strange calm. My mother's voice echoed, faint but clear, the one I had heard in childhood whenever storms rattled the shutters. "Stay quiet, then strike when ready." I straightened my back and took another bite of cooling lasagna. Damon laughed too loudly at something Clarabelle whispered. I let them think I was none the wiser, though every fiber of me burned with the knowledge that the play was underway, and I was waiting for my moment to speak my line. The sight of my forged name pulled me backward. Through years, I thought I had neatly folded away. Savannah's streets had watched me stumble through widowhood, holding a child by the hand and a stack of bills under my arm. I was 32 when Harold died suddenly, leaving me with Damon and a house that creaked more than it stood. The Victorian was small by comparison to the grand homes of Gaston Street, its paint peeling and porch sagging, but it was ours. I worked double shifts at the public library, shelving books until my knuckles cracked, then tutoring neighborhood children late into the evenings. Some nights I came home too tired to cook, so I'd eat toast while Damon devoured the spaghetti I stretched from the pantry. I kept ledgers, spiral notebooks, where every cent had its place. Rent, utilities, groceries, a sliver of savings. When Damon needed new shoes for school, I shaved off the column marked treats. When he was 12, the orthodontist told me braces would cost more than I made in 3 months. I nodded as though it were simple. I packed extra sandwiches to sell at work, typed term papers for college students at $1 a page, and skipped lunches. Damon never knew. I wanted him to smile without shame. By the time he was ready for college, I had built a modest fund, not enough for luxury, but enough for him to start at Georgia Southern without loans. I remember the day we signed his acceptance papers. He barely looked up, too busy tapping messages to friends. I told myself it was just youth, not ingratitude, but patterns form quietly. When Damon overdrew his first bank account at 20, I paid the fees. When his used car broke down, I borrowed against my own savings for repairs. Later, when credit cards swallowed him whole, I dipped into retirement to pull him free. Each time, he promised to do better. Each time, he sank again. I closed my eyes at the dinner table now, breathing past the ache. I had built my life like a ledger sacrifice balanced against hope. Yet as I watched Damon's hand hover too comfortably near those fraudulent papers, I wondered if my careful columns had been teaching him not discipline, but entitlement. Clarabelle came into Damon's life like a glittering showpiece, the kind that catches the light and blinds you before you know what you're staring at. She was younger than he by a handful of years, her nails always manicured, her hair curled into glossy waves that never seemed to wilt under Savannah's humid air. At first, I welcomed her. I wanted my son to know companionship, stability, maybe even the kind of love I had carried for Harold. But Clarabelle's stability was built on sparkle. Within months of their marriage, a new SUV gleamed in their driveway, chrome wheels flashing like jewelry. I knew Damon's salary couldn't justify it, yet he beamed as though he had climbed a mountain to provide it. Soon after came the diamond earrings, the designer handbags. The photos of weekend trips to Miami and Cancun splashed across social media. I stayed quiet, though my stomach tightened each time. I remembered Damon's childhood of worn shoes and secondhand coats, how I had pinched pennies so he would never feel less than others. Now, watching him live far beyond his means, I wondered if my sacrifices had simply fed an appetite he no longer knew how to curb. One evening, as I set a basket of rolls on their counter during a Sunday supper, I heard Clarabelle's voice carry from the hallway. She laughed lightly, unaware I was near. She's so old-fashioned. She said, just sitting on money she doesn't even use. If Damon and I had access, we could finally live the way we deserve. The words cut sharper than she intended, though perhaps that was the truest thing about them. I stepped back quietly. letting the conversation trail off without my presence revealed. That night, as I drove home beneath Savannah's moss-draped oaks, I turned the question over and over in my mind. Had Damon inherited my discipline? Or had Clarabelle's hunger swallowed it whole? My mother, Pamela, had a way of making lessons stick without scolding. She could turn supper into arithmetic, stories into blueprints. When I was a girl, she would slice a pie or sometimes a simple pan of cornbread into 4 pieces and set them before me on the table. "This one is for what you must have," she'd say, pointing to the largest wedge. "Roof over your head. Food on your plate." She touched the next slice. "This is for what you save, even if it's just coins in a jar." Then she moved to the third, smaller piece. "This is for others. You don't get far in life without remembering someone else's need." Finally, the tiniest slice. "And this is for joy. A little frivolity keeps you human, but no more than you can chew without guilt." It was a simple ritual, but it shaped me more than any textbook. I grew up believing security was built not in grand gestures, but in steady division, in boundaries that kept both hunger and greed in check. When Harold died, and I stood staring at bills that outnumbered my paychecks, it was Pamela's voice that kept me from despair. "Divide it. Althea. Protect each piece. Don't let desperation or desire devour the whole." Years later, when Damon began borrowing faster than he repaid, those lessons pressed harder. I sat across from a local attorney, Mr. Leonard, in a small office that smelled of old paper and coffee, and asked about establishing something no one could tamper with. Together, we built an irrevocable trust. Assets shifted where a single signature mine or anyone else's could not undo them. I told no one, not Damon, not Clarabelle. At Mr. Leonard's suggestion, I linked a small checking account to the structure, seeded with just $1. It acted like a tripwire. Any attempt to access what wasn't theirs triggered a fraud notification to my phone, and, if needed, the authorities, a sentinel, quiet but vigilant. I never imagined needing it against my own flesh and blood, but as I sat at Damon's table now, Clarabelle's laughter still echoing in my ears, I felt my mother's wisdom surround me. Pamela had left no fortune, only foresight. Perhaps that was the truest inheritance of all. The lasagna had grown lukewarm, but no one seemed to notice. Damon's phone buzzed on the table, screen glowing with an unfamiliar number. He tried to silence it quickly, yet the vibration carried across the wood like a pulse neither of them could control. Clarabelle's eyes flashed. "Not now," she hissed, low enough to pretend it wasn't meant for me to hear. Damon shifted in his chair, thumb fumbling to decline the call. His knuckles whitened around the fork. I lowered my gaze, as though too absorbed in slicing a neat square from the casserole to have caught anything. But every librarian learns to catalog not only books, but people, their pauses, their tells, their half-finished sentences. That call would find its way onto my mental shelf. Clarabelle was the first to break the silence. "Althea," she said with a brightness that felt forced, "we wanted to talk to you about something important. It's really about family." The word family lingered, like perfume too sweet to disguise the sour underneath. Damon cleared his throat. "Mom, you know things have been tough lately. The economy, the market, all that. We've been thinking it only seems fair to redirect a portion of the inheritance, for stability, for everyone's good." I placed my fork down gently, folded my hands as though preparing for story hour. "A portion," I asked, my voice even. Clarabelle leaned forward, eager now that the curtain was drawn back. "Yes. Nothing unreasonable, just what's necessary to wipe the slate clean and give us a fresh start." Damon nodded, eyes darting between me and the untouched wine glass at his elbow. 250,000, he said finally, the numbers tumbling out before he could coat them with justification. The sound of it echoed in my chest, heavier than any figure I had logged in my ledgers. A price tag pinned to decades of sacrifice. I smiled faintly, the way I used to when children at the library stumbled through an answer I knew was wrong, but wanted them to keep talking. And these debts, I asked softly, they come from what? Exactly. Damon swallowed hard. Clarabelle answered for him. Too quickly. Business ventures. Opportunities that didn't pan out. Nothing unusual. I nodded, tucking every detail away like a card in its proper drawer. My fury hidden behind the practiced calm of someone who knew the story wasn't over yet. Damon leaned back in his chair, wine glass in hand. The angle of his shoulders rehearsed like a man trying to close a deal. Mom, he said, voice soft but firm. You don't need all that money. You've got the house, your pension, Social Security. We could reset with it, wipe the slate clean. The words we and reset curled together like smoke, filling the room with something I could almost choke on. Clarabelle picked up the thread, her tone laced with practiced sweetness. Think of the bigger picture. Althea, this is about family legacy, about keeping us strong for the next generation. Don't you want your grandchildren secure? Her gaze lingered on me with a hint of triumph, as if the mention of grandchildren was the ace she had been saving, and it nearly worked. For a moment, the room blurred, and I saw Damon, not as the man before me, but as the boy with a mop of sandy hair who once pressed wildflowers into a library book, proudly presenting them as though he'd discovered treasure. I remembered the nights I stitched his Halloween costumes by hand, the mornings I tucked an extra cookie into his lunch bag. My chest ached at the thought that perhaps giving in was simply another act of love, one last rescue. My hand trembled as I reached for my napkin. Steadying myself against the pull of that memory, that was when my mother's voice came back to me, steady as the tide on the Savannah River boundaries, our love's guardrails. I had repeated that line to myself for years, when Damon begged for another bailout, when Clarabelle rolled her eyes at my refusal to co-sign a loan. Tonight, it carried more weight than ever. I folded the napkin neatly, pressing each edge until my hands stopped shaking. Then I lifted my chin and met Damon's eyes. No, I said quietly, but with a firmness that surprised even me. Something flickered across his face, disbelief, then anger. Clarabelle shifted in her seat, bracelets clinking, already preparing her next move. I had made mine. The silence after my refusal stretched long enough for the cicadas outside to fill the space. Damon's fork scraped against his plate. A harsh, grating sound. Clarabelle's painted smile faltered, then returned sharper than before. You don't understand, Damon began, his voice tight. This is for the best. You can't hold on to everything when others need it. I folded my hands on the table and let my gaze settle on the sideboard. I saw the papers earlier, I said evenly, my name scribbled across them in a hand that isn't mine. The color drained from Damon's face. Clarabelle reacted quicker. That's ridiculous, she snapped. You're imagining things. Those were just drafts, ideas. Her words cracked at the edges. Damon shook his head, trying to recover. Mom, no one forged anything. We'd never. My phone buzzed before he could finish. The vibration rattled against the wood like a gavel. Striking. I lifted it, the screen glowing with a bold red banner. Fraudulent access attempt detected. Identity theft flagged. I turned the screen so they could see. The bank is quicker than you think, I said, my voice steady. And the trust was locked months ago. Every move requires my attorney's signature as well as mine. You can't touch it, Clarabelle lunged across the table, fingers reaching for the phone. I drew it back, my chair scraping against the floor. Damon caught her wrist mid-motion, but his eyes pleaded with me. "Mom, please. You don't know how desperate things have gotten. We just need a chance." The sound of his desperation cut deeper than his lies, but I didn't waver. I rose slowly, the weight of years pressing on my shoulders and yet lifting me all at once. "This isn't family support," I said, each word deliberate. "This is crime." Clarabelle slumped back, muttering under her breath. Damon lowered his head into his hands, the room thick with their panic. I stood there, phone in hand, the red warning still blazing across the screen, and felt the guardrails my mother had spoken of settle firmly into place around me. The weeks after that dinner unraveled with a kind of inevitability, as though the storm had always been waiting just beyond the horizon. Damon and Clarabelle's creditors closed in fast, banks demanding payments, credit card companies filing suits. Each envelope that arrived at their doorstep carried another weight they could no longer shoulder. Desperation drove them to contest the trust, their lawyer arguing undue influence, claiming I had been manipulated into locking it away. But the court saw what was true records signed months before, medical affidavits confirming my clarity, my attorney's steady presence through every step. Their petition dissolved like sugar in rainwater, not long after. The house on Gaston Street was stripped of its gleam, notices pasted to the door, belongings carted out piece by piece, curtains drawn where neighbors once admired the shine of their new SUV. By the time the repossession was complete, Damon and Clarabelle had relocated to a cramped apartment west of town, where the walls were thin and the carpets worn. Savannah's circles are small. Word traveled quickly. Friends stopped calling. Invitations ceased. Their sparkle dimmed into shadow. I did not gloat. I simply carried on. At the library, the place that had steadied me through every season of my life, I began hosting quiet workshops. We called it Pamela's 4 Slices. After my mother's cornbread lesson, seniors came with notepads. Young couples brought strollers and questions, all of them hungry for a way to set guardrails around their lives. We talked budgets, boundaries, and the courage to say no even when love pressed hard against reason. Sometimes, when the afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows and dust motes floated like tiny lanterns, I would look at the circle of faces and think of Damon, how I had once wanted to give him everything, and how giving too much had cost us both. Money can vanish. Respect must never. That truth had carved itself into me as deeply as my mother's voice once did, and it was the legacy I now chose to pass on.